And so I'm now going to show you the most important slide I ever can put in a talk. And it's actually unnerving because I don't care how many people I put on this acknowledgement slide. I can look out there and see about 100 people I probably should have acknowledged in terms of informing our research and the work I'll talk about today. But I'm going to be shameless and opportunistic. And in the next, hopefully less than 20 minutes, I will present as much of my fellows' work in hopefully a cohesive way, really focusing on how changes in development can impact self-control and considering that as a context itself. We all know that the adolescent brain and adolescent behavior has received a lot of attention from the media. I tend to refer to it as the media darling. And it's because we can really voyeuristically just open up that head and look at while the teenager is behaving and doing what they're doing and seeing how the brain activity is changing during that time. Now, too often, the way that we describe this period as if it is a brain that has no brakes, no steering wheel, and only an accelerator. And that's suggesting almost as if there's a hole in the head. But when you open it up and look in, it looks pretty close to an adult's brain. So what's important for us to try to understand is how this typical, and I'm going to suggest necessary stage of development, how there are changes in the brain that allow it to meet the many different challenges of the adolescent period, from physical, cognitive, sexual, and social. And we usually talk about this period as beginning right around the onset of puberty, but when we talk about the end, if the definition of adolescence is the transition from being dependent on a parent to relative independence, many of us have discussed how our children may be in that period for a long, long time financially. But over the past decade, and trying to really look at brain and behavior correlations and associations, we've been able to characterize the teenager as an individual who is incredibly sensitive to rewards, also sensitive to threats, social influences, and we think it's a combination of these things that impact their degree of impulse or self-control and their risk-taking behavior. There have been at least 3 neurobiological models that have been put out there to try to explain the adolescent brain. One of the first that Larry Steinberg talks a whole lot about in his work is the dual model system. This suggests orthogonal hot-cold systems that presumably map onto a limbic system and a prefrontal region. And it's more value-based. And then there is, it's a lovely heuristic when you're talking to the media or you're trying to change policy. And then there's an elegant model where Monique Ernst and colleagues sort of tried to separate out aspects of that limbic system according to valence, linking positive and negative valence to the accumbens and the amygdala, respectively. And then we built on that work, and actually in the mid-2000s came up with a model that we think is more circuit-based, largely based on work by Adriana Galvan at that time, looking at specific circuits and how regions within those circuits had differential patterns of development. And that's the imbalance model. Sarah Jane Blakemore has recently published a paper where she talks more about a mismatch in development of regions such as the amygdala and the accumbens too and prefrontal cortex. This is an interesting perspective to try to get away from an imbalance that I think some people think has a negative tone to it. I don't particularly, I'll try to unpack that. But this is just talking about volume differences. And there's no room for the circuit or the connections to really change here. So let me just show you this little video where what we know from the non-human animal and human work is that there are a number of systematic changes in the limbic system, particularly subcortical systems, where you get strong local connections. You see peaks in neurochemicals like dopamine and neurotrophins and endocannabinoids as well. And you see that occurring before you see it in this green area in the prefrontal cortex. And so what our imbalance model suggests is during adolescence, with this regional development, you get this sort of imbalance when you're in the heat of the moment, where the limbic systems tend to win out. And so it's not that the amygdala and the accumbens can't call or signal the prefrontal cortex. It's just that that system and the distal projections are not fully mature. So really, all these regions, if you're getting a projection in these subcortical systems, they're still developing. They're still forming those connections. And this is different from adults because this circuitry is mature. And it's also different, and this was what was so wonderful about Adriana's work. Not only did she show differences from adolescents to adults, which I'll show you in a moment, but also how these effects are adolescent specific and are not seen in children as well, which we think is because there's immaturity in ascending as well as the descending projections. And in simplistic ways, we've talked about this building on John Cohen's sort of idea of the prefrontal cortex as vulcanization of the brain. And we talk about the imbalance of being on the Starship Enterprise. And you've got Mr. Spock, who is logical, and you have Captain Kirk, who is someone who has passion, and he can show rage, and sometimes he flies by the seat of his pants. And when he does that, if they're on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise, that's when Spock is needed. So what I'm suggesting to you is it would make sense during this period of development that you would want regions to call a system that's going to help you regulate so that you no longer need your parent to be your self-regulation and you can do it on your own. This is very similar to learning data, Earl Miller and many others, where they've shown changes in subcortical systems before prefrontal. So we're just suggesting it's a more protracted period during development. So how do I define self-control in the context of this symposium? Well, self-control is really our ability to suppress maladaptive thoughts, actions, desires, and emotions in favor of adaptive ones. And if we go back to how adolescence is characterized in the most recent work, really we're talking about aspects of self-control. And two different descriptions come up of the adolescent multiple times, as if they're synonymous. They're impulsive and they're risk-taking. And I want to unpack that for you a little bit, because really there are different developmental trajectories for risky behavior and impulsivity and slightly different overlapping neural circuitries. The way we measure impulsivity in the laboratory, we can use an anti-saccade task, a stop signal. We like to use a go, no-go task or whack the mole task. At this point, since you want a cocktail, I'm not going to have you proceed in this task, but basically all these tasks do is they build up this habitual or prepotent response by having many targets that you're pressing to. In this case, the sneaky mole that keeps popping up in your garden that you don't want there, so you whack it. I will tell you, in a psychiatry department, it was really nice to get them to say instead of whack, yes. And so you're hearing, yes, 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 every time the mole popped up. And people were trying to come in to see the excitement and enthusiasm was about in the psychiatry department. So what you don't want to do is mash a vegetable. And so basically, the mole can be tricky. You don't want to press him. And you want to press to him, but you don't want to press to the eggplant. So if I had each one of you perform this task, you would see that there would be individual variability in your performance. I know some of you might be a little bit lower. And then if we looked across development, what you see is this ability is really emerging right around the late adolescent years, teenage years. But if we put these in neat little bar graphs, like we tend to do, you wouldn't see this variability, and you would basically see sort of a monotonic decrease in the number of times you whacked the mole when it was actually a vegetable and you should not have. Now, we know from TMS studies and lesion studies in non-human primates that there's certain areas of the brain that make it more difficult for us to engage in impulse control. And when you perform these tasks in the scanner and you look at the pattern of brain activity, you basically see a region in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. And the activity in this region, when you're correctly able to engage in impulse control, correlates with the actual performance. And we see across development that there's this monotonic decrease with age from childhood to adulthood. Notice children are activating this region more for the correct trials, and they're actually the same ones who are having the most difficulty on the task if you just look at their overall performance and this signal. But there is nothing adolescent-specific in these data. It's just continuing to decline in terms of the amount of activity and the number of errors. So now I just want to move to some of the work that brings in reward, value, incentives, and how that drives our behavior. And this is really, again, focusing on the elegant work of Adriana Galvan, who, when she was doing her thesis, she got tired of people saying adolescents do what they do because of the prefrontal cortex. And so she wanted to try to look at reward circuitry and decided to use a paradigm that Wolfram Schultz was using with his non-human primates when he looked at dopaminergic firing to those rewards. And she used a couple of paradigms. The one I'm going to talk about today is one in which you simply had 3 discrete stimuli. These are pirates. And unbeknownst to the subject, you mapped reward for those cues onto different amounts of money. Now, the task they had to do was simply to say what side of the screen the pirate was on, which is pretty easy to do. So even children can perform this at 95% accuracy. But what she saw in their performance, even without the subjects being able to articulate this, that when they saw a cue that later predicted a larger reward, reaction times got slower and slower. And even though they were getting a single coin, when they pressed to this cue, they got significantly slower. It's indeed relative. Now, in this task, when you place it in the scanner and you look at the pattern of activity, the question is what maps onto these differences in latencies? And not surprising to us is that reward circuitry involving the orbital frontal cortex and the accumbens are showing monotonic increases as you increase the amount of reward the individual gets from small, medium to large. And you see that in the orbital frontal cortex too. But Adriana wanted to know, how does this change across development? Because at this point, people had shown differences between adolescents and adults, but we really didn't know what was going on with children. In this orbital frontal region, what we see is there's a decline in activity when you perform tasks like this as a function of age group. But the striking differences were in the accumbens, an area that's very important about learning about outcomes too, and there was an exaggerated response in this region. Now, why is this relevant to adolescents and their behavior? Because the activity to reward is actually correlated with the amount of likelihood of engaging in risk-taking. So activity to receipt of reward was then correlated with their self-reports of this risky tendencies. And we also know that when adults are about to make a risky decision, we see elevation in this region as well. So these were the data that led us to develop the imbalance model, and it was basically showing accumbens is beginning to asymptote before the prefrontal cortex. It's also the case that social influences can impact us, and I want to go back and sort of link social influences, just simple cues. Larry Steinberg showed just having a peer next to you can lead to you engaging in risky behavior. But I want to highlight work by Leah Somerville, who was a postdoctoral fellow at the Sackler Institute. And basically, what Leah did was she examined the patterns of behavior and brain activity when instead of having a mole that you were whacking and trying to refrain from whacking the produce that was appearing out of the ground, she used smiling social cues, smiling faces that were developed by NIMSTEM, Nim Tottenham, who developed NIMSTEM, another fellow from the Sackler Institute. Told you I was going to get all these guys in. And so what she showed is when you ask adolescents not to press to a smiling face relative to a neutral one, that they can't stop themselves. They have a really difficult time not approaching that positive cue, and you're not seeing that pattern in children or adults. And if you look at the neural correlate of that, it's the same region that we see is elevated in the teen when they are receiving a large reward. So What I cannot do is have a talk about self-control and not highlight my work with Walter Mischel. So hold this in mind, and I want to talk about individual differences, and then I'll bring it right back to that. And that is, with Walter, we had this wonderful opportunity to look at his original cohort of children who had played the delay of gratification game, or marshmallow task, when they were 4, and we brought them back when they were 40. We actually scanned them at Stanford in collaboration with Ian Gottlieb. And the question that we had is, are low delayers and high delayers, are the low delayers simply impulsive? And so we can use tasks like the whack-the-mole to examine that. But what we did is we tested these individuals in their mid-40s, and we broke them out into those individuals who, over the years, had looked like they were consistently low, and others who looked like they were pretty consistently high delayers. And we had them perform the impulse control task where they had to stop and not press to a neutral expression, versus having to stop themselves and not press to a smiling face. We use these social cues because marshmallows just don't do it for us when we're in our 40s. There are other things that we are very social beings. So the results for just the neutral or kind of cold version of the go, no-go tasks showed no differences between these groups. But the minute you had this appetitive social positive cue, those 40-year-olds who couldn't wait to get 2 marshmallows, in their mid-40s, they're having trouble waiting and stopping themselves when they see something pulling their attention, something that was alluded to earlier. And if you look at the neural correlates of this, overall across the task when you're performing the no-go trials, it's the case that low delayers are not activating this region in the prefrontal cortex as much as the high delayers, but the area that really discriminates them based on when their performance is really faltering on those hot trials, again, looking down on top of the brain, this is the axial image now, it's in this area in the nucleus accumbens. So just to summarize those findings for you, there are developmental and individual differences in self-control where adolescents show a heightened pull, more false alarms to these positive social cues, and so do low delayers. And the neural circuitry is very similar across these. The last few minutes, I just want to talk about threats as well. And this is work by Michael Dreyfus, an MD PhD student, reanalyzing data from Todd Hare's thesis. He's now at Zurich. And basically, all this is examining how adolescents respond when you don't have a smiling face, but now you have a threat cue. That is, I don't think that this fearful face is scaring you right now, but we have learned over a lifetime that something bad or there's some uncertainty in what's going on around us. And so we orient to these as if there is potential danger. And using the same task and using these cues, we were surprised to see that teenagers look like they're drawn to danger. That is, they're reactive to these cues relative to neutral, so we always have that control baseline. And you don't see these patterns in children or adults at all. Now, we know from Todd Hare's earlier work that when you see these cues, that structure that I was talking about earlier, the amygdala, is actually heightened in activity in adolescents when they're presented with these cues. And so that comes back to the circuitry that we talked about at the beginning of the task. No longer are we talking about valence-specific behavior, right? Because we have positive and negative cues, but we're talking about an action-based, how you're approaching that information. And so part of what I didn't unpack in this circuitry is that, yes, there's signals to the prefrontal cortex, but there's this really interesting circuit that's a projection from the amygdala to the accumbens that Stuber has shown with optogenetics, if you activate it, it leads to approach behavior. And so with these local connections that we're suggesting are forming during adolescence, then what you get is more action-driven responses when the system is activated and you don't have the prefrontal cortex projections to inhibitory cells there to sort of blunt that effect. Aaron Heller, who just left the Sackler Institute for University of Miami, wanted to test this. So he looked at connectivity patterns based on a whole host of subjects we'd run on the emotional go, no-go across age. And he wanted to see if the strength of the connection between the amygdala and accumbens was actually related to errors. And what he showed is the stronger the connectivity between these regions, the more false alarms that you get. But what was also interesting, to bring it back to the prefrontal cortex so we can look at this little component, I'm really simplifying the circuitry tonight, is that the ventral prefrontal cortex actually modulates this, so that the stronger the projection from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, the fewer false alarms that you're making. And that did not hold when we looked at the prefrontal cortex to the accumbens. So these results suggest that adolescents are impulsive, regardless of the valence of the cues during this time when we look at simple impulsivity tasks in the heat of the moment. We think that's driven by changes in the circuit locally before more distal prefrontal systems can actually project to modulate those systems. I just want to end this last minute and say that if it is the case that a region, a subcortical region, is still receiving prefrontal projections, then basically what we're saying is that's protracted development of that circuitry. And so Ali Cohen has been trying to understand, when does the capacity for self-control and regulation mature? Because you're in New York State, a place where age of majority is 18, but you can charge and actually try a 16 or 17-year-old as an adult. And there are also a lot of policies across the United States in terms of whether or not you're 18 or 21, in which you're deemed an adult. And so she has been using these same two tasks that I described, and her basic question is, does a 18 to 21-year-old look more like an adult on these tasks or look more like a teenager? And what she's shown is that 18 to 21-year-olds do not differ from younger teenagers, but they do differ from older adults. Likewise, if it's a threat cue or if it's a smiling face. So these are things that we need to consider and are very relevant for policy. So on that, I'd just like to end and say, adolescence is usually described as this roller coaster ride of a lot of thrills, but actually they're thrills and fears. And it's important for those to have the opportunity to occur so that they can actually help rewire the system to help regulate these systems for moving forward and being able to engage in adaptive behavior that's necessary in adulthood. So thank you for your attention and for waiting this long.